parasite control but not relying on drenches?
Yes, I mean, we're lucky in the last few years that we've all of a sudden had a couple of new molecules, new drench families come to the fore, but before that it was a veritable desert really. We had about 20 odd years with no new drench families there at all, and it looked pretty bleak when it came to resistance issues. And I guess the issue to the forefront for my thinking these days anyway is using drenches responsibly and not becoming over reliant on them, as I feel that we were a couple of decades ago, and probably was very instrumental in creating the problems that developed with resistance to various groups of parasites.
Can we look at breeding? Like, I mean, they're getting rid of foot rot through Lincoln's research.
Absolutely. Well, everyone probably involved in the rural sector will remember quite clearly 10 to 15 years ago the big all the big noise made about breeding for resistance, whereby groups of animals were bred to resist heavy parasite challenge and actually minimise the level of infection, if you like, that these animals sustained. There were two major problems involved with that. One is there seemed to be some genetic traits which were very closely linked to resistance traits, and they weren't very conducive to good production systems. So in other words, by breeding for resistance we lost production gain in other areas. And the other problem was a lot of resistance involved very good immune response towards the parasite populations, and there's an inherent cost to the animal when an immune system is triggered. There's a lot of protein lost, and so perhaps in recent times the buzzword for genetic influence in alleviating parasite challenge is a word called resilience. And so now the exciting thing in the fore is breeding animals that are resilient to infection. In other words, they still sustain quite notable infection levels, but the effects on their production is minimal. And so the problems with losing a lot of protein on mounting an immune response aren't there, and so we end up both with animals that can maintain good levels of production and show very little ill effects of quite a heavy parasite burden. So these are the things that are coming up to the fore, and these are the sort of genetic areas where perhaps farmers may be more interested in looking these days.
How important is it to keep a fecal egg count up?
Well, that's the good old tried and true method, is only using drenches when they're required, and so there is some inherent level of immunity that develops, especially in adult animals. And so when you're looking at using drug therapy or drenches, just simply monitoring fecal egg output, especially in sheep, can go a long way to minimise drench use when it's not needed. And that's particularly important, I feel, also in horses. So any people involved in bloodstock should maybe take a leaf out of the old farmer's book these days as well, and perhaps not go over-reliant on drench use without first monitoring fecal egg counts.
What about this in refugia?
In refugia is a very important concept, and it involves diluting out the proportion of a population of parasites which potentially is resistant to drugs or drenches. And the importance of understanding this is knowing that the majority of a parasite population is present on pasture. And so the hallmark of using in refugia involves taking a proportion of animals that seem to be coping with parasite infestation relatively well and leaving them undrenched, so that they will shed parasite eggs and larvae around the pasture that haven't been subjected to drench use, and so hence there's been no selection pressure on that population of parasites to make a high proportion of that egg output or larval output resistant to the drug concern. And so if a population hasn't been exposed to a drug, well then there's very little need for there to be resistance pressure or pressure to develop resistance in that population. By leaving a proportion of those animals undrenched, they're going to shed lots and lots of eggs and larvae, and hopefully the theory is that a big proportion of their output is going to be totally sensitive to drugs when and if they're needed. The experimental work certainly does seem to back up the theory. So another little concept to be thinking about is perhaps relying on animals that are looking okay and actually leaving them undrenched in a proportion of a population. Perhaps some well-doing lambs that have low DAG scores, maybe don't drench those, and that way we can maintain a good proportion of the environmental contamination, still going to be sensitive to the drugs when we need them.
Because we need to be sustainable as well, don't we?
Absolutely, yeah. So, and all of these concepts are involved in sustainable drench use. Using other species, cross-grazing areas of land. It's well known to most people, I think, these days that sheep parasites, internal parasites, affect sheep. They don't tend to affect cattle and vice versa. And so using cross-species grazing to vacuum up, if you like,
exactly,
contaminated pasture is another good way to minimise the requirement of drenches.